Greetings and salutations. I am illustrious brother Eddie Leo Gabriel Sr. I am the current most powerful sovereign grand commander of the Supreme Council of Louisiana, ancient accepted Scottish rite of Freemasonry. I would like to welcome you as you join us on this journey into our great organization's one-of-a-kind history. I would also like to thank everyone for being a part of this special evening.
All right, good evening, good evening. First of all, we want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight and being with us tonight. We're very excited about what we have in store in the future. Tonight is going to actually be our first installment of the Eddie Gabriel Senior Educational Series. And we brought in some heavy hitters tonight, and I'm excited. Two of these guys I have a great deal of respect for. They're very knowledgeable about organization, and I'm just glad and honored that they even agreed to do this with us tonight. I'm sorry, I have people coming in here. Okay. Tonight we're gonna have Brother Michael Poe of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. He's gonna give us a presentation on his introduction to the SCL. But yes, sir, Michael Poe, I have a great deal of respect for him. He's in my mind, and to me, he's a successful Mason. He's a good Masonic role model, a successful author, and I just appreciate all the research that he does, and I don't really think he get to my knowledge, he don't get the respect that he deserves, But like I said, I've been following him for a while, and he's one of the guys that inspired me to want to be a Scottish Rite Mason, and he helped me to appreciate what Scottish Rite Masonry was and is today. And I just want to give him the floor and allow him to do what he do best. Brother Paul. Unmute your mic, Brother Paul.
Okay, I think I did it.
I
appreciate, and I'm very honored and pleased to be here with you, brothers. And I really am excited to get into this because the idea of doing a presentation in multiple sections is really the only way that I think that you can appreciate this. But in all honesty, if I could take just a minute, because just before this all happened, right before I was getting ready to sit down and eat dinner, something happened that impressed me and affected me that I'd really like to share it before I start off with you. I don't think it's any debate that 2020 has been a rough year with this COVID virus going on, everything that's been happening. I've been pretty much housebound. The only time I give talks is online. But one of the things that we've been doing is I try to go to grocery as rarely as possible, maybe once every week and a half, and we get most of our stuff shipped in. And I got today 2 deliveries, one from Walmart, one from Target, with groceries. And right before dinner, the doorbell rang. And I didn't know, I thought maybe it was another delivery or something. And I looked out the little peephole to see who was out there, and it was my next door neighbor. It was a lady who lives next door. And she had a box in her hand. And I thought that maybe a delivery had gone wrong and went over to her instead of coming over by us. And so I opened up the door. She had a mask on, so I put my mask on real quick. And I opened up the door, and she said, "I just want to let you know," she says, "I have this box." She says, "The city of New Orleans has been distributing a bunch of these." She says, "to different locations, and then we distribute them out." She says, "I want to bring you this box of food." She says, "and everything is clean inside this." She says, "Everything's been preserved and cooked at a local restaurant." And she says, "There's about a half dozen little dishes in there." And it took me completely off guard. And I wasn't prepared for somebody to do something like this right now. And I thought about it. We are a divided country. We got a lot of roughness going on, a lot of things going on, but this gave me hope that maybe if we think about the other person, maybe we can do something to help everybody. And that's what this taught me, and it's making me realize that we all need to do a little more for the people right around us. If everybody does something for somebody around them, we can do a lot. But excuse me for getting into that. It was something that I had to get off my chest. This discovery of the Supreme Council of Louisiana, and really all of Louisiana Masonry, because it's all tied in together, has been something that I've been working on for the last 45 years. And one of the things that I'm amazed at is not just the lack of knowledge that so many have of the history of the Masonry, but I've seen too many people have negative opinions about history itself. And what I mean is, not long ago, there was a Mason who talked with me, and I was telling him the importance of learning Masonic history. And he says, well, it's not important. And he tried to get philosophical on me. He says, the past doesn't matter. The future doesn't matter. All that matters is right now. And I understood what he was talking about, because he was saying that, what we did yesterday, we can't fix. Yesterday is gone. Whatever we did, good, bad, whatever, that's gone. And tomorrow, we don't really know what's going to happen tomorrow. So from that standpoint, I understand that we have to live right now and do what we need to do right now to live. But the truth of the matter is that history gives us a foundation, and it builds on who we are as individuals. And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, I was at the doctor's for a checkup, and I was sitting in the waiting room. And while I was waiting, I picked up a magazine and I started flipping through it. And I noticed a story in there, and the title caught my attention right off. It said, "Who am I?" So I started reading it. And it was a story about a guy who was found on a downtown Chicago street unconscious. He was found by the police, and it was about 2:30 in the morning. And he was unconscious, dressed in a business suit. And he had no wallet, no money, no watch, jewelry, anything on him. And he had a large injury to the back of his head. He was an apparent victim of a mugging. And they took him to the hospital, and he spent the next 2 days unconscious in a hospital bed. Well, when he finally came to, everyone, was happy for that, but he was completely disoriented. He didn't know where he was, what happened to him, anything about anything. And the doctors told him to relax. They said, just give it a little time, let your head clear. So in a little while, his head started to clear, and he started to realize what was going on. But instead of things getting better, they got a lot worse, because the guy realized that he didn't know his name. He didn't know where he was from. He didn't know anything about himself prior to waking up in that hospital bed. He had complete and total amnesia. And what the guy was talking about in this story was that regardless of what money or credit cards or whatever these guys stole from him, that didn't matter. Because what they took from him that was really important was his life. Because whoever he was prior to waking up in that hospital bed, that guy's gone. And he's not going to come back until he knows who he is. And if you think about it, every single one of us has a history. And it's made up of all the memories that we have. You go back to the earliest memories you have as a child, your family, loved ones, friends, going to school, growing up, getting a job, getting married. All these memories, all the way up from the earliest one you have until just before logging on here. That makes up who you are, and every single one of us, regardless, even if we have a twin sibling, we are unique individuals. And if, just like that, our memories were completely gone and we had no idea who we were, who would we be? We wouldn't be the same person we were a little while ago. And this concept of you are the total of your history or your memories doesn't just apply to individuals. It can be groups of people, organizations, anything, countries. Long time military generals have known that if you want to defeat another military, you have to make sure that your soldiers are stronger, better equipped, more of them, and then you can overpower the other guys. But if you want to destroy a whole civilization, you destroy their history. Because if you destroy their history, they disappear. Look at the Mayan Indians. They had a massive culture, and they had a library that was tremendous. But all that's left now is 3 books. The Mayan Indians were completely destroyed. They destroyed their history. My wife got her bachelor's degree in archaeology. In northern Louisiana, she did a dig at an Indian site, and it's known as Poverty Point. And they know that there was a massive community there 2,000 years ago. It was a central hub for trade and commerce. But they know this, but they know zero about the people because there's no history left. So while I believe that we have to live in a moment, I do believe that our history is vital to understand. And it's not just the Supreme Council of Louisiana. It is also the Grand Lodge of Louisiana and the Supreme Council of Southern Jurisdiction. That triad, those 3 are missing so much of their very early history. And until we understand all 3, we're not going to fully understand any one of them, any one element. Now, what I wanted to go back to the very early days when I began figuring things out. I joined Masonry in 1975. And not long ago, I read something that was written by a past Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of Indiana, Dwight Dames. He says, all Masonry is local. And it's true. When I joined, the only thing I knew was my own experience, my lodge, what was going on in my little circle. And what I knew was when I was an entered apprentice, it was still at a time where there was a number of people joining. We hadn't gone into the big decline yet. And when I was an entered apprentice, they would take me around to different lodges to visit. They say, okay, there's an entered apprentice degree going on here. I want you to come see it. And the thing that I knew was that there were 2 types of lodges in the New Orleans area. There was York Rite lodges and there were Scottish Rite lodges. I didn't really know what that meant, but that's what I knew. And I knew when I saw the degrees, I said, wow, that's pretty different. They're certainly different from each other. Why they were different, I didn't know. But as time grew, I began learning things. And one of the things that I realized that I hadn't known was, because this was my experience, I thought this was the way it was everywhere. I thought everybody knew about Scottish Rite Craft Lodges. I found out very quickly when I started going outside Louisiana that no, they had no idea what that was. They truly, when I'd say a Scottish Rite Craft Lodge, they'd say, what in the world are you talking about? And they didn't understand. Now, all that I knew about Masonry before I joined was that my grandfather was a Mason. I knew that he was past master of his lodge, and he was a 32nd degree Mason. That's all I knew. So as I began my Masonic career, I had a little knack for ritual. So I started getting involved in ritual. And before long, I ended up becoming the youngest district grand lecturer in the area. That was one of the guys who would teach the ritual. And after a few years after I joined, somebody came up to me and they told me, why don't you think about joining the consistory? That's what it was called. I didn't really know what that was at first. And I said, what is that? They said, well, that's where you get your 32nd degree. And I said, my grandfather had a 32nd degree. I'd be honored to join this. So I joined. And one of the things that I learned quickly, there were 2 members of my lodge who held a 33rd degree, which in itself is not unusual. But the office that these guys held was unusual. Both of them were the presiding officers of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana under the Southern jurisdiction. And at first, I didn't know what that meant, but I was quickly told, well, they don't exist anymore. And there was a feeling of hurt and anger about it. And I realized quickly that there was something going on. And these 2 guys, one of them, his names don't probably, it's not gonna mean anything to anybody, but it was Fred Siegel and Frank Vaccari. Fred Siegel was an attorney, and the Scottish Rite bodies were on Carondelet Street. He had his law office right down the street, about a block away on the other side of the street on Carondelet. I used to go there several times a week to talk with him and learn with him. And Frank Vaccari, he was a cantankerous older man. He was well up in his 80s at that time. He's long gone, both of them gone to their reward now. But it was about several meetings after I joined the consistory that I was walking around at the bottom floor. They had 2 buildings, an older one and a new one. And I was walking around the older building, and I was looking at all the pictures that were on the wall. And Brother Vaccari was sitting there, and he was looking at me walking around. He says, come here, boy. He says, sit down, let's talk. So we started talking, just shooting the breeze, nothing much being said. And I asked a question that I thought was a simple, innocent question. And when I did, till the day I die, I will never forget the look on that old brother's face. I asked him, how come we're no longer a grand consistory? That old man, his face, it was a look of hurt and anger that I had never seen on his face before. And I didn't know why this was, and it was like a literal dark cloud came all over him. And he just stood there shaking his head. He said, you don't know what happened. You don't know what happened. And he was right. I didn't know what he was talking about. He said, they took everything away from us. He said, we used to be a grand consistory. We used to be a Supreme Council, but they tricked us. They took it all away from us. I didn't know what in the world he was talking about. I said, who? You boys in Washington, D.C. I learned quickly that there was a mixture of tremendous hurt and anger, and there was not always a clear reason why. And that's all that I could see. But I know anytime I mentioned the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, there was hurt, there was anger. And Fred Siegel was the only man I know who served as the presiding officer of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. And then upon their constitutional change, the presiding officer became the Venerable Master of the Lodge of Perfection. He's the only one who served it, and actually he served at the head of all of the bodies. But there was a clear something that was there. And I couldn't figure it out at the time, but I knew that there was more going on than I was aware of. And then there was a second event that happened, and it must have been a few months later. I had gone, and it was called the Gold Room. That was the room where they held the meetings, the consistory meetings. And I got there a little early, and I sat down. I would always try to sit back towards the middle. I guess if you, direction-wise, I'd been sitting in the southwest area in the middle. And I sat there and I was talking with somebody, and we were deep in conversation, and I wasn't paying attention to everybody who came into the room. And finally, we stopped, and I happened to look to my right, down the same aisle, straight down. My eyes almost popped out my head, because what I saw this man, an elderly man, and I looked at his regalia. And I had studied the books. I had Clausen's Commentaries of Morals and Dogma when it was given to me. And I tapped the guy next to me. I said, "Who is that?" And he was, "Shh, don't say anything, don't say anything." I said, "No, who is it?" And they said, "He's a 32nd, just like you." I said, "No." I said, "I know that regalia." I said, "That's the regalia of a sovereign grand commander." They said, "Shh, don't say anything. I'll tell you later." Well, later I found out his name was Rudy Glazer, and he was made a Scottish Rite 32nd degree in the Grand Consistory of Louisiana a number of years earlier. And he worked in the oil business. It was either a promotion or a transfer, but he was transferred out of the country. And it was either El Salvador, Nicaragua, one of the countries there, I don't remember now, but he moved there on his business. And when he went there, apparently he thought he was going to stay in this job until he retired, because he joined the Scottish Rite there in this country. And they were in full fraternal relations with the Southern jurisdiction. Now, he spent a little time there, and they must have liked him. They must have thought he was of value, because all of a sudden he received a 33rd degree. And then soon after that, he was an active member of their Supreme Council. And then not long after that, he was elected Sovereign Grand Commander. So he worked himself up in this position, and then all of a sudden, there was a political uprising in the country, and Americans were in danger for their life. So he had to leave the country, and so he resigned as Sovereign Grand Commander, and he became past Sovereign Grand Commander. He moved back to New Orleans, and he rejoined the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. Well, what happened, the Grand Commander at that time was Henry Clausen. And he looked at it, he says, okay, he can come back in. We're more than glad to take him back in, but he's 32nd. And he would not allow or recognize his 33rd degree. And that was why it was an insult. Now, why? I can't exactly tell you. I've always had suspicions about why. But that's why, now eventually he became he got the 33rd in New Orleans, but it was the Southern jurisdiction 33rd, is the white cap, and he was an honorary Sovereign Grand Inspector General, but he continued to wear his regalia until he died. Now these situations, all part of what my early experience. When I remember distinctly, Fred Siegel was the master of the 9th degree. At that time in the Southern jurisdiction, the 9th degree was an independent degree, and he was master of it. And when I went through the degrees, the best way I can describe it was like coming home. That's what I thought of that's how it impressed me. It was a system that had the philosophy of integrity, honor, duty, justice. It was everything that I was looking for. And then I countered that with what I was seeing. And the New Orleans Scottish Rite Southern jurisdiction, from what I could determine, and the best way I can describe it, it was an emotional place. There were people who sincerely cared, deeply cared, but they didn't understand who they were or what they were. And from the earliest time that I joined, my memories of the consistory, I heard of the Supreme Council of Louisiana. It wasn't called the Supreme Council of Louisiana. It was called the New Orleans Supreme Council, but it was the same body. And it was spoken of like it was a Shangri-La. It was the place where everything was done right. Everything was done perfect. It was the idea, and it was taken away. The catch was, not once in the following 10, 15 years after I joined, almost 20 years, did I know that the Supreme Council of Louisiana still existed. I was told specifically, and it was in the books, that the Supreme Council of Louisiana ceased to exist and died in the late 1800s. And when the first person who told me or questioned it was a French Mason, Alain Bernheim. We were writing back and forth, and he said, "Why do you keep saying that they don't exist? I think they exist." And I said, they can't possibly exist. And I'm getting into an area about ready to stop because I want to continue this later. But I truly, truly did not believe that the Supreme Council existed. And when I first became aware of it, I was sitting in a chair and I was reading this email from Alain Bernheim. And I said, not possible. And I picked up the phone book, and there it was, as big as life, right in the phone book. And I wrote down there, and it was Grand Commander Philip Washington at the time. And I talked with him, and I didn't believe him at first. I thought that this was some recreation of a historic body. And next conversation, I don't want to take up the whole evening, but the next talk, I'll talk about more of how I systematically wanted to prove that this Supreme Council of Louisiana was not the original one. And I ended up proving exactly the opposite, that it is the same Supreme Council that was created in 1839, and the whole history. And it opened up a new door, and it opened up a new avenue of research, because prior to that, I thought I was researching a dead body, that's something that ceased to exist. And all of a sudden, I'm researching something that actually does exist. So it had my whole system changed. But my brothers, if I can close with one thing, please don't believe that you don't count or that your body is not important, because it's very important. And the history is vital to know. And there are constantly new things coming up. There's research that's constantly going on in the period of the mid-1800s. And it's gonna come out. And please hold together. Please keep this organization going. It's more important than you have any idea. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Any questions?
Thank you, Michael Paul, Brother Michael Paul. Do anybody have any questions for Brother Paul? Our next speaker is one of my Masonic mentors. I've been on on the phone. I can understand he keep you on the phone for hours and hours and hours. Like, you call him, ask him one question, he'll take you back to the 1800s. But he's a very intelligent brother. He's a great researcher. He's one of my favorite. He got us right, basically. Next, we want to have Brother Kevion Rogers.
Hey, good evening, brothers. All right. So I actually made a PowerPoint that I wanted to share my screen with, and then but I uploaded it to the to the chat screen. So what I thought was like very interesting, that was very piecemeal in the history, was what was going on during the Civil War era, and particularly the history about like Eugene Chasniak, and also like how he integrated his lodges, and also brought the recognition of the SEL. So what happened was, when Murat was the Grand Master of the Grand Orient of France, basically Pike and them had threatened to pull recognition if they didn't take away Full House's 33rd patent, which he had received in 1845. So going forward, when Eugene Chasniak became the Sovereign Grand Commander in 1867, this was like going towards the end of the Civil War, just before the Louisiana was being readmitted to the Union. So during that time period, what had happened was, in 1867, he had said that he was going to integrate his lodges, and then because of that, Eureka Grand Lodge, which was their original name for Prince Hall, Louisiana, actually sent 5 of their lodges and sat in Liberty Lodge number 19, and which was Eugene Chasniak's lodge. He was the worship master of that lodge. So, and then they had recognition with Prince Hall, Louisiana, and the SEL then. And then in that same year, he ended up chartering Eugene Chasniak, Le Progress, and Fusion Masonic 23, which still exists, as lodges for colored people and under the SEL jurisdiction, because at that time, due to segregation, blacks and whites weren't legally allowed to meet together. So they had to create those 3 lodges so that they could, fulfill the legal obligations that depended on them, right? So, but what was interesting was that in the history that I read, that the Grand Orient actually had a hand in helping them out. So there was this lodge called Alphonse de Hiram that was from Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe is like a French island in the Caribbean, and they actually had members who had came up and actually helped with that, with the founding of those lodges and stuff. So not only in 1867, for the integration, not only did Eugene Chasniak play a hand, but also Eureka played a hand, and the Grand Orient of France played a hand. And this meeting happened within the symbolic chamber, i.e. the Blue Lodge of Liberty Lodge. So in other words, this wasn't necessarily a top-down activity. This actually was a bottom-up activity. And so, so some people, I remember they were trying to say that, it was, the Supreme Council that had organized all that stuff. But actually, according to the records, this was done through the symbolic chamber of, of i.e. the Blue Lodges and stuff, And it wasn't, and also too, you have the interesting fact that is like St. Cyr, when this happened, Louisiana technically wasn't a part of the Union at that time. It was actually still a sovereign independent, because of the Articles of Confederation. So even at that time, technically it wasn't a part of the United States. And hence that's also one of the reasons why they had that name change when it was reincorporated in 1870. So yeah, in fact, it was incorporated March 16th, 1870. By the state legislature of Louisiana. Okay, so in other words, is that you have these things happening from going from, say, the Supreme Council USA to becoming the Supreme Council of Louisiana. And, that little name change, like, was one of the things that, like, had piqued my curiosity. But then finding out that it was due because of the Civil War, all of a sudden it made sense to me why that name change happened. And then all of a sudden it was like, well, how come if something that was a predominantly, white people involved, how did these black people get involved? And then that was answered through Eugene Chastniak integrating the lodges. And then because he had did that, General Millionette, who was the next Grand Master, they actually were originally from the same city in Nantes, France. He actually extended recognition back to the SCL because of that. And then in 1868, when that happened, they actually had adopted the constitutions and regulations of Grand Orient France as to be their official constitutions. And in that interceded period, which is interesting, is that if you go back to the original charters for the Grand Consistory, the symbolic chamber actually had control of both the French Rite and the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. Okay, so even through this entire period, so for instance, when the Grand Lodge had declared control of the Scottish Rite, they never mentioned the French Rite. So in other words, that throughout that entire period, the Grand Consistory never had relinquished control of the French Rite. So even if you want to argue continuity or regularity, that is easily applied through their French Rite tradition, and that was never opposed. And then in 1864, they actually had got a charter for the Rite of Mizraim too from the Grand Orient. So they actually have under the SCL, the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, the French Rite, and the Mizraim Rite under their their control. So it's just like when you actually start digging into the narrative and stuff, it was very piecemeal and stuff. I had to go to the Grand Orient records, I had to go, et cetera, to try to flesh out how this narrative happened and stuff, and that's also spoke to a lot about, how did the ritual evolve too, because it's like the Louisiana working is very unique, and so, and by knowing that, they had these three different rites working under their jurisdiction, I saw easily how different, pieces from those systems got integrated and incorporated in that what we actually do, and so that was very fulfilling, because when I first became a Mason, I got the Louisiana work, and all of a sudden when I started to visit other places, they're like, what are you doing? I've never seen or heard about that, just like Brother Paul was saying. And so I thought that was, so that right there triggered me to really want to know about, well, why is New Orleans so distinct and unique and stuff, and then that actually gave me a fuller appreciation of what was going on. And also prior to that, my step-grandfather on my dad's side, he actually was SCL Mason in Petty's Pride. I think that's the name of the lodge. So, and I also had a great uncle who was also a member of Petty's Pride. So, I also have familial ties to the SCL, so it's, so it's just like I said, it's been a very fulfilling, rewarding journey. Okay. And that's all I have at this moment.
Just curious, Kevion, what was your relatives' names in Petty's Pride number 58? Just curious.
So Charles Rose, and he died maybe about 13 years ago or something like that. And he was Methodist, and then also Walter Coleman, because I always called him Pop, so I had to actually think of his legal name. But yeah, those are the two brothers, who first introduced me into Masonry. And actually, in fact, when I first was seeking Masonry and stuff, I originally tried to contact SCL people, but I think y'all were downtown, and I didn't know because I thought y'all were still at that building up on St. Bernard. So that had threw me off. So so like I said, the history in the and my intrigue runs deep, and also my current law, Cervantes number 5, one of his predecessors, Los Amigos del Orden, James Fullhouse was his worshipful master when it had went to the SCL, during that break in 1850. So like even my current lodge is intimately tied to the history of the SCL. Yeah.
Are there any more questions?
Well, Kevion, the Cervantes was also created by merger with Silencio Lodge, which was under the Supreme Council of Louisiana.
Exactly. Yep. So we have it's like 2 times over SCL connected. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, and also, what's actually interesting with Silencio, actually, I did a presentation about a month or 2 ago with the Supreme Council of Mexico, because Ignacio Comonfort became a Mason in that lodge, and he was the president of Mexico at that time. And they actually started a lodge in Veracruz, and that was like their lodge number 1 before it was healed over by La Fon Ladebat. And so even the history of Freemasonry, the ancients have the Scottish Rite and the lodge system in Mexico and Cuba. Actually, not only is it linked to Silencio, Los Amigos No Orden, but overall to the Supreme Council of Louisiana. So even in Latin American Freemasonry, their ultimate origin is actually SCL. So, so it was very interesting history, to see what was going on in that whole time period. And then actually seeing how the ritual evolved in Cuba and in Mexico. And then, some of the other places like Panama, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, they also use the Castro ritual. So what was interesting I saw is that in 1859, there was actually 2 symbolic lodge rituals that were in use by the SCL. One was a Spanish ritual by De Castro, and then one was an English ritual that was passed between James Fullhouse and Charles Atwood. And so the Atwood version of the ritual is actually published in the Collectana, I think volume 15.
Well, it's located in northern jurisdiction. I found that probably in 1990, somewhere in the northern Jersey. Well, when are you coming back to New Orleans?
Man, I can visit and stuff, but my wife, she's from Birmingham, so basically, I won't say I was, but yeah, I see like I'm gonna be out here for a long time.
I got a question. I don't know if we're jumping too far ahead. Can you elaborate on the connection between the Supreme Council of Louisiana and the Supreme Council of Jamaica Kingston?
Oh yeah. So if you go all the way back to early Louisiana history, so this is pre-Grand Lodge and all that stuff, right? You had 2 times over back in the early period, first period, you had like Consulate Mason and Lodge of Perfection, and that actually comes directly out of like the Marin. And then they died out in 1868 because of Freemasonry was illegal under the Spanish, and it was brought back. And then you had De La Hogue, and so De La Hogue, he came from Charleston. He actually was one of the original founders of the Supreme Council there, and he was a furniture maker and also the father-in-law of DeGrasse Tilley. And he actually resided in Louisiana, I want to say about like 6 years or so before relocating to Paris. And so we had that, and then you also had the lodges like 1806, 1809, 1811. We had like a lodge, symbolic lodge, Lodge of Perfection, a Rose Quad chapter, and a consistory that was founded out of the actually the Grand Consistory, Kingston, Jamaica. But that was raised from a 25 body to a 33rd because DeGrasse Tilley became a prisoner of war, and he was relocated to that island while he was a prisoner of war. And then, so that body became like the Supreme Council of the British West Indies, the Leeward and Westward Islands, I think it was.
Well, that was the 1802 one. That was right. The first one. The Kingston was 1804, early 1804.
Exactly. So all of a sudden, like literally, not only do we have direct lineage to the original Charleston, but we have direct lineage to Kingston, which was really like number 2, number 3 Supreme Councils, and that body itself was originally established by Marin. In fact, Marin and Franklin are buried in Kingston, Jamaica. You know, so we are tied to the prehistory and the post-history of the Order of the Royal Secret and of the of the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. You know, and we're the only jurisdiction that can claim that. You know, so and also because of revolutions and all that stuff, a lot of places actually had died out or banned masonry and stuff, and we're the only high-grade Scottish Rite body that has absolute continuity. You know, no questions asked. You know, so that also makes us unique too.
All right, we have a question from Mr. Chavez Omar.
Hi, hello everybody. How are you?
Hey,
All right.
Good seeing you again.
Yes, Michael, brother Paul, Kevion. First time I hear you, man. Very nice to see you, brother Paul. Nice to see you well. Let me see if I can make sense out of this. I have several questions, but right now, first, the only one that I want to place here is we know that the Castro, he was heavily influenced by Silencio. He was a member of, and he was very impressed of what he saw in Louisiana, and he extrojected all that he saw in his rituals in the Gran Oriente, Cuba y las Antillas. So at this point, my question is, the Supreme Council of Louisiana how can I say it? Is the Gran Oriente of Cuba las Antillas, it was based in its structure, the way it worked, like the SCL? I mean, we know that the Castro worked in 5 degrees. The Blue Lodge has 5 degrees only. Well, 5 degrees, and then he went straight to the 6 degree up to the 14, which he called the secondary education. And then for the 5th up to the 18, which he called the secondary, and from the 8th to the 30, it was the secondary, and then it was the normal education. So the Supreme Council of Louisiana worked like that, starting from the 6th degree up to the 33.
So, all right. So from the records actually of like Los Amigos of Order and Silencio, they actually worked that way. But when I looked at like Osiris Lodge, Liberty Lodges, and Sincerities, like bylaws and stuff, they actually stuck to the old French method. So they stuck to like 1, 2, 3, then shot up to 18, 30, et cetera. And that's actually like the current method of how the SCL works. So I think now is actually unique to the Spanish and Italian lineage and stuff, because if you remember when the Supreme Council was brought down there in 1839, you had Orazio, the Telis, and the Pietri, and they actually brought the Neapolitan constitutions with them. So like the statues of the Greek gods and all that stuff was added. And so, I think if you remember prior to that, also they had the Adoniramite system. So the perfect master, which was the 4th degree in that system, became the 5th degree in the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. And that was considered a symbolic degree. So to maintain that continuity, all of a sudden you had to inflate the degree structure, to keep it in harmony. But the other lodges, they were still rocking, like I said, the French Rite and the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. So they didn't have that issue, because when Montelot rewrote the restructure, so that was like 1885 through 1886, anything that was like overtly biblical, he kind of deleted from the French modern Rite. So like the 4th degree or like the perfect master got deleted, and so all of a sudden you jump to the elect master. And then also the because of the French Revolution and they had a concept of inequality, they also deleted the venerable master ritual and stuff. So all of a sudden you had the restructure that was apprentice, companion, master, elect, Scottish, Knight of the East and Rose Croix, and they also deleted the Fifth Order. And in fact, the Fifth Order wasn't actually brought back until maybe like 20 years ago in Brazil, So, so you had these anomalies, but because Louisiana had already separated from them, we had kept a lot of those old traditions. So, for instance, you can read in the minutes and stuff where they're conferring the, perfect master, and they're conferring the Elu, as Mike Pohl was saying, the ninth degree was its own order still, and that was in 1970s, so we kept that old French structure going up, but it still maintained that old, say, like Scottish philosophical, the Marseille tradition, because remember, Étoile Polaire was originally chartered out of Marseille. So that the Marseille tradition had like Interpreter, Spellcraft Master, Perfect Master, Elu, Ecose, Chevalier de Orient. Then the Venerable Master, you had to be a Venerable Master to even become Rose Croix. Rose Croix was an invitational body at that time. So, and that goes back, Marquis de Gage back in 1763 and communicated with Duke de Clermont. They actually had mentioned that they intended to keep Rose Croix as an invitational body. So in other words, you had to preside over the Blue Lodge and basically the Knights of the East before you were even considered to go Rose Croix. And you can see some of those traditions were still held up. So for instance, so this guy named Don Fries, he had left, and I actually was a pro tempore virtual for Cervantes for about 9 months. And we had a brother who was receiving his 5th year apron, and he introduced me to the installation secrets of the Ancient Seventh Scottish Rite. And it was a combination of that old French, the Gage, Montelot stuff, and also something that looked kind of like the Mark Master material, and I just thought that was very weird. But then in my researching Masonic history and stuff, I saw, oh yeah, indeed, that is the material from the French and the Ancient and Seventh Scottish Rite traditions, and it was fused into one thing, so all of a sudden it was just are we the only one on the planet doing this? What is this thing,
Well, Kevion, there was a practice that in the 16th district until maybe the 80s, that if you were made a Mason in one of the York Rite lodges, you could join the Scottish Rite, any of the Scottish Rite lodges, but you could not become Worshipful Master unless you were reinitiated into the Scottish Rite through that lodge. And that was always an interesting thing. You had to go through the Scottish Rite initiation in the 3 degrees before the lodge would accept you as its Worshipful Master. So that went to about the 80s, I'd say, all the way up until the 1980s. Because I remember when I joined, that was still, because there were several that weren't. And you weren't, Louisiana is one of the few jurisdictions that does not have a right of visitation. And it had to do with a battle between a Scottish Rite Lodge and, a York Rite Lodge and a French Rite Lodge. And so anyone in a lodge can object, and the Worshipful Master does not have the right to overrule a member of the lodge. So Louisiana, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana does not have, and I know Texas is surprised at that, because they say, well, every Master Mason has a right of visitation, not in Louisiana. That's one of the strange results of these wars that went on.
Actually, we have that same principle here in Mexico. The York Grand Lodge of Mexico, we don't have right of visitation. Everybody can object a visitor. Mm-hmm. So
that's interesting.
And well, this is not a question, but just to end my participation, just a bit of a trivia. The Grand Orient of Mexico, which became extinct in 1890 with the Gran Dieta Simbólica, it was chartered, to my understanding, by the Supreme Council of Louisiana. And after it became extinct, like 5 years ago, they reappear, and they try to prove the irregularity based on France using the charter that it was given by the Supreme Council of Louisiana. I haven't seen it. They haven't shown it publicly, but they claim that they have it, and they claim that the Grand Orient of France came here and actually vouch that it was the original. So, and everything that I've been investigated in Mexico, inevitably it ends up in Louisiana. So that's really, really important for us. Thank you guys for having me.
No problem, brother.
Brother Paul, I know we pressed for time, but Brother Paul, I have a question for you. At one time, was the Supreme Council, before they of Louisiana, they were once a Grand Consistory, correct? Before they got their higher degrees, or what? Am I correct?
Not completely.
Okay.
The Supreme Council of Louisiana organized itself in 1839. The Grand Consistory of Louisiana was already in existence. The Grand Consistory of Louisiana did not pass under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council of Louisiana for about 3 or so years. And the reason was the Grand Consistory of Louisiana had bounced between jurisdiction after jurisdiction after jurisdiction. Every time a Supreme Council they'd pass under their jurisdiction, the Supreme Council would go dark. The Southern jurisdiction, on and on, the CERN bodies, on and on. So the Grand Consistory didn't want to pass under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Council of Louisiana until it was sure, my opinion, that they were going to survive. And so after several years, then they passed under. So it wasn't the Grand Consistory became the Supreme Council. However, if you look at the old minutes of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, there were several periods of time when the Grand Consistory was not under the jurisdiction of any Supreme Council, and they changed their name to the Sovereign Grand Consistory of Louisiana. And the question has always been, during that time, it was in the early to mid 1830s, prior to the creation of the Supreme Council of Louisiana. Question has always been, did they make themselves a Supreme Council? And the only way you can really answer that is if they created 33rds. And we don't know. That's one of the question marks. And one of the interesting things was the Concordat of 1855. We found the minutes when that happened, and they went through a specific set of procedures. They had half of the active members of the Supreme Council of Louisiana, and the sequence of events happened was the Supreme Council downgraded itself into the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, and then the Grand Consistory of Louisiana absorbed that 1852 Albert Mackey Consistory. And everybody who sees the minutes says, how can a Supreme Council downgrade itself into a Grand Consistory? A Grand Consistory cannot absorb a Supreme Council without the Grand Consistory becoming a Supreme Council. And I personally believe that that was one of the reasons why Henry Clausen would not allow a legitimate active member of a foreign Supreme Council to be a member of the Grand Consistory of Louisiana. But this is getting way off. Yeah. The Grand Consistory of Louisiana is a body that needs a lot more research and study, because there's a lot more secrets in there that we don't know yet.
You mentioned this, sir. No, what part did that play into the formation of the Supreme Council of Louisiana, or the Grand Consistory?
The Grand Consistory is different. Supreme Council, none.
Okay.
The Grand Consistory, yes, and there was a very specific reason why, and that was because the Grand Lodge of Louisiana was created in 1812, and they were very interested in having fraternal relations with the other Grand Lodges around. And in 1812, at that time, the deputy, the Lieutenant Grand Commander of the Cerno Supreme Council was the Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of New York. And surprise, surprise, and there's a long reason why, all of the active members of the Supreme Council Southern Jurisdiction were at that time considered irregular Master Masons by the U.S. Masonic community. So the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, which made up most of the Grand Consistory members, had a decision to make. Do we go with Cerno, they got the Grand Master on their side, or do we go with Charleston, where the Grand Lodge of South Carolina, the one that was recognized, considers all the active members of the Charleston Supreme Council irregular? So that's why they went with Cerno. And the Grand Consistory went that direction. By 1816, that had resolved itself, but at the same time, Cerno was growing in popularity, and a lot of people were saying, why not? What's the problem with them? And that was the reason why the Grand Consistory went with Cerno. And there was a big debate and a big schism in the Supreme Council of Kingston, Jamaica. Half the body went with Cerno, half the body went with Charleston, and I think that ended up being one of the reasons for their collapse. But the Supreme Council of Louisiana is not a Cerno body. There was one of their, Jean-Francois Canarge, who was one of the early sovereign grand commanders of the Supreme Council of Louisiana, had been the commander-in-chief of the Cerno Grand Consistory of Philadelphia, so Pennsylvania. But that's the only real connection to Cerno that I've seen, and possibly one of the other 33rds might have received his 33rd from a Cerno Mason. But it was the 33rds who created the Supreme Council of Louisiana were by far recognized as legitimate 33rds. I think one of them was from Spain, and there was a couple of places where they were considered okay. And the Lieutenant Grand Commander, the guy who was the first Grand Commander, had taken part in the creation of the United Supreme Council of Western Hemisphere, but that had ceased to exist. So it's not fair to say that the Supreme Council was Cerno, but the Grand Consistory most certainly was. Right. If that answers.
Yeah, because remember Orazio, when he got his 33rd and stuff, Supreme Council of Western Hemisphere actually was St. Laurent. Right. Yeah. Remember it was it was Eliza Hicks. Now still technically was the Grand Consistory of New York. But then when St. Laurent came over there, he was the one who elevated to like a 33rd degree of HSF Scottish Rite, And that's when Orazio Tilly's was made, a 33rd. So actually his lineage is actually St. Laurent's lineage. But if you remember going back to Cerno actually was the representative of Germain Hackett, who was a sovereign grand commander of the Supreme Council of France under the Grand Orient of France. And he had said that he represented him both in his power and his dignity as sovereign grand commander. Okay, so, that, and then all of a sudden that's when you start seeing the changes in Cerno's body in New York. So the thing about it is that even when you talk about Cerno and the ancient accepted Scottish Rite, that was done through communications with the Grand Orient. Okay, so you have Hackett lineage and you have St. Laurent's lineage playing in that New York lineage, for the ancient accepted Scottish Rite. Okay, and so remember our 1811 charter for the Grand Consistory came out of Kingston, but that was, like I said, a short-lived body. So once Louisiana became a state, we had to get down with somebody in the United States, and Cerno was the most acceptable person at that time. So all of a sudden in 1813 they got a new charter for the Grand Consistory. And so if you look at the dates for the Grand Consistory, you'll see an 1811 date, and then you'll also see an 1813 date. And that's where that 1813 date happened.
Well, 1813, there was no Grand Consistory of Louisiana. It became the Grand Council.
Right.
Until they switched again under the Southern jurisdiction for a short time. So that it was just a different structure.
Right. So like I said, this is very interesting, like history, how everything is fleshed out.
And then we'll eventually get into the 2 Grand Consistories of Louisiana and the 2 Etoile-Polaire lodges.
Right.
Okay, I know this is a public event, so I'm trying to find questions that, you typically hear a lot and that, some people might want to ask or know. So, off the top of my mind, I can think of, when it comes to Scottish Rite Masonry, you mentioned it a few seconds ago, the Grand Ordinance de France. You always hear that, like, it's almost like in order for you feel, to feel like you're a legit Scottish Rite Mason, for some, they always have to mention their organization. What is the connection with the Supreme Council of Louisiana and the Grand Ordinance?
I just told you several fold. If you remember, if you just want to say SCL proper by that name and not talking about the Grand, Supreme Council of America and USA and that back lineage, you remember when they started admitting blacks, the lodge and chapter Infants of Hiram from Guadeloupe actually participated in that. So Grand Orient actually participated in the founding of the black lodges of the SCL.
Yeah.
Okay. So you have a material connection with that through the French and Scottish Rite traditions of that in 1867. Okay. So even prior to that, if you remember, Etoile-Polaire, when they received their Scottish Rite Charter 7474, that was from the Grand Orient. You had Pierre Vassal, who was the Grand Commander at that time, and you had also Nicholas Charles Desertong, who was the secretary, the Grand Secretary of the Grand Orient and stuff. And in fact, his ritual is still a part of our ritual till this day. Mm-hmm. So even not only through charters and minutes and memberships, remember, James Fullhouse received his 33rd degree from the Grand Orient in 1845. So, because Louisiana was a French territory, our masonry starts from a French tradition. Mm-hmm. So you can't separate us from them because our lodges were geodip lodges.
Kevion, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit on one thing.
All right.
What the Grand Orient, Etoile-Polaire Lodge, and the Supreme Council of Louisiana, you got to go to the George Long collection and look at the Etoile-Polaire minutes book. When there was political maneuvering. Albert Pike and James Fullhouse were at war with each other. And James Fullhouse knew that he had to do something. Now, the Grand Orient pulled his 33rd during a time when their Grand Master was friends with Albert Pike. But when he was short-lived and they got a new Grand Master. However, the Grand Orient didn't want to embarrass itself by saying, we made a mistake, we shouldn't have pulled his 33rd, so they let it go. However, following the Civil War, the Grand Orient was outraged that the whole of U.S. Masonry was using race as a membership judge or evaluation by race. And they came out with the statement that if they find any U.S. Grand Lodge using race to determine membership, they will go break relations with them.
All right.
Eugene Kashanak found this out, and Etoile-Polaire Lodge had split in two. The majority of Etoile-Polaire had gone to the Supreme Council. A minority remained with the Grand Lodge, and there's legal reasons, and I can get into that right now. But according to the minutes, what I believe is that James Fullhouse was working very closely with Eugene Kashenak and had this plan, and he was stepping back because by that time he had removed himself. But I believe he was the tactician involved in this. And Eugene Kashenak went to Etowah-Polea Lodge and said, look, this is what we're publishing. And they published, the doors of our temples are open to anyone, regardless of race and religion. And Etowah-Polea exploded in rage. And it wasn't that they disagreed with him or disagreed with what he was saying, but they said it was hypocritical in the minutes. And they said, you're making it sound like this is something brand new. And if this is something new, then how do you explain brother so-and-so, brother so-and-so, brother so, because they're not white. And I know Perseverance Lodge, Pierre Roop is listed free man of color. And there was a lot of that earlier, that what laws and such, they didn't care about all that stuff. But it seems like, and that's when the Supreme Council, Etowah-Polea, Polar Star, pulled away from the Supreme Council because they got their nose out of joint. They said, this is hypocritical. You can't just say that this is something new because it's not new. And there was a lot of political maneuvering at that time, and they were trying to work. Albert Pike come up and he trumped them by saying that the Grand Orient doesn't believe in God, doesn't require belief in God. And the fact was that they only did require it for 20 years. And the whole time where everybody was seeking relations from them, they had the same belief, and there was a reason for it. It had nothing, you didn't advance in the upper degrees if you were an atheist, that's for sure. But there was a lot more to what was going on than what we often see because of the political maneuverings that were going on.
Exactly, because if you remember the year prior, the Grand Orient, not the Grand Orient, but the nation of France actually had signed a memorandum of understanding basically with the Roman Catholic Church. And then there was a guy who was a Presbyterian who had basically left the church and went into politics, and he decided that the belief in a single supreme deity and the immortality of the soul shouldn't be requirements to be Masons under Grand Orient. And so that's when that was removed from their regulations. And, and that's what, that whole thing came about. And so, but that goes to that whole slippery slope concept, right? Because it's like, okay, if you don't have to be a monotheist or a believer in immortality of the soul, then you start widening the doors of the West Gate, right? And as you can see, the consequence of that is that the Grand Orient drifted away from what we would call the norms of Masonry over time. Why it may have had noble intentions, what they said, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
That's true. But the fact was, they only had the requirement to believe in God for 20 years, and all the years from their creation. And that was because they followed the 1723 constitutions from England, which didn't mention a deity. Right. It just said you have to be moral. It didn't mention religion or God or anything like that. It just said, so they followed that up until, 20 years before 18, wherever it was, 60, whatever, when they made the switch. So the U.S. Grand Lodge did not want to be embarrassed. The community didn't want to be embarrassed by the Grand Orient, say, oh, you bunch of bigots, we're going to break relations with you. So they used this God issue to break with the Grand Orient before the Grand Orient could act against them. And it was political. It was just maneuvering.
Brother Paul, now that you mentioned this, there is a part in, I can't remember if it's in the GOCA, Grand Orient of Cuba y las Antillas, but I'm pretty sure I read it on Silencio, where it says that they accepted atheists. They were able to accept ATS, but there is an explanation about it, and it says that if the candidate says no, they will try to convince it. They try to tell him otherwise. But there is one of them, I can't remember if it's Silencio or if it's the Grand Orient of Cuba, which says that if he says no, we will wait, and it will be, and he by himself, he will learn the truth in the 5th and the 4th degree, because that's when we're going to teach him that there is a God. Could it be that the Grand Orient of Cuba, of Louisiana, have the same principle like that?
I spoke to one of the grand historians of the Grand Lodge of New York 25 years ago. And he told me something that I've never been able to confirm. But he said that when the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, when they were created in 1812, they petitioned the Grand Lodge of New York for recognition. The Grand Lodge of New York would not extend fraternal relations to the Grand Lodge of Louisiana for a couple of years. And the reason was the God requirement was not in Louisiana, the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. And we don't have any records going back that far. We have no way of knowing if that's true or not. And he wanted to know from me if that was true. And I said, there's no records. I don't know. But I found that very interesting because the close ties with the Grand Orient at that time, I'm wondering if there was some influence in the whole of Louisiana, because the Grand Lodge of Louisiana was dramatically different prior to 1850 than following 1850.
One last question. Y'all somewhat touched it a little bit. In the early years of the Supreme Council, how many, like I said, you touched it somewhat earlier, but to be more specific, how many rituals or rites did the Supreme Council work in its earlier? I know Kevion said French, the modern rite. Well, here, I'll let you answer that question.
So from what I've seen, actually like looking at the rituals and that were mentioned with different lodges and stuff, like I've seen, of course, at the Monseigneur, which is like early French rite, like pre-Grand Orient modern rite, right? Of course, you had like disciples of Masonic St. Andrews. They were working French rite proper. You had like Los Amigos de Orden that had the Adonai Ramite material in Spanish. Then I've also saw like further along, like in the 1880s, 1890s, they had some French lodges that were working Ragon's material. Okay, so and then I've like I said, we still have Desert Thomas material in there. Vassal's materials in there. And then I've also seen, of course, the 1864, y'all had the Mizrahim Rite Charter. And then so, you had like, basically it was just like, when I looked through the actual regulations and constitutions, there's no mention of a standard ritual. So basically whatever the lodge decided to do, that's just what they did. It's because, you also had the Castro's material, which is like wildly different from everybody else's. So, but if you wanted to like, quote unquote, neatly categorize them, then you want to say, okay, French rites and probably like 6 variants, Ancient and Septet in like 2 or 3 variants. The Mizrahim, I think Osiris, number 8, they eventually went over to the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. I think they're in Gretna, and they now they're York Rite Lodge. And then you had like the women's stuff. So you had the adoption rite. You had like the French adoption rite, and then later, I want to say like in the 20th century, actually, the SCL adopted the Eastern Star material. So, if you want to put in like neat categories, then you could say French, Ancient Accepted, Mizrahim, right? And then the women's stuff, but when you actually look in there and actually see what they were actually doing, it's a lot more complicated than that.
Brother Paul, would you like to So
Basically, you had the Grand Orient of Louisiana come out of the Supreme Council of Louisiana in the late 1800s, and they got a Master Mason certificate for Rene Matoyer, who ended up becoming the Sovereign Grand Commander. They merged back, but there was, you see, the 16th District is, they have their own versions, each of the older lodges. There's not one Scottish Rite ritual. Shivanti's ritual, we know that their original one was more possibly like the Jacobite rite. Germania's ritual, original German language ritual, it's clear that it was a combination of the Scottish Rite, French Rite, and York Rite. Whoever the original translator was, they sat down with three rituals and they put them all together. So Perseverance was French Rite. Perfect Union, which is now York Rite, was originally French Rite and then Scottish Rite for a while. So there's the Supreme Council has had a number of rituals. When 1850 came, the new Grand Lodge of Louisiana says you can be York Rite and you can speak English and that's it. So the lodges that were French Rite, the French Rite and the Scottish Rite had their divisions, and they came together. The French Rite says, well, we don't have anybody, a superior body to go to. The Scottish Rite lodges could go to the Supreme Council, but the French Rite was stuck. So the Supreme Council took them in, just like they did the Prince Hall York Rite lodges. They would take in if there was a need, if it was applying. So there was a number of different rituals that worked. And I'm not even going to get into the Matthew McLean Thompson stuff, you know. Right. But the Supreme Council of Louisiana can rightfully be credited with saving a lot of ritual masonry in Louisiana in the mid 1850s and so.
Okay. I mean, I know it seems like I'm struggling with my words, but, you know, usually with our conversations, we're able to speak freely. So, I mean, I'm trying to find a way to, you know, because I'm struggling with what I can and what I can't say. But so as y'all look at the rituals as they become more standardized and just across the board, is it fair to say that our rituals are more of a collection of all those rites?
Let me tell you one thing, and I can't get into this, but there are markers in rituals. The Scottish Rite rituals of the Grand Lodge of Louisiana, 16th District, they vary. However, there are certain markers that remain in all of those lodges. And the only other place that I've seen those particular markers, the Supreme Council of Louisiana. There's no question that there was, that we are one. And I mean, too many lodges went back and forth. Too many members went back and forth. And, you know, I've heard all the way until the 1920s and 1930s, we had an old Mason who died. He was 100 years old, just about 5-10 years ago. He was telling us about those other Scottish Rite Masons used to come over and help us with degree work. What other Scottish Rite Masons was he talking about in New Orleans at that time? You know, so there was, I have a letter from Albert Pike raising hell with a number of the New Orleans 33rds because they were going over to the Supreme Council of Louisiana and visiting during their Supreme Council sessions. And you can't do that, no more. Make sure nobody does that again. So the New Orleans Masons, there was a lot that has been forgotten, and what I believe caused the forgetfulness was the fact that George Long had served so long that there was no notices in the newspapers for any deaths. And I think that because he served so long, everybody just assumed they were gone. And because I promise you, I never heard a single word that the Supreme Council of Louisiana still existed, but I sure heard about them. And that was the interesting thing.
Kevion,
yeah, like I said, wait a second, go ahead, brother.
No, I was about to say, hold on, I don't mean to cut you off, but I think Brother Whitfield had a question. And
go ahead. Hey, Brother Lauren.
Sorry. How you doing, everybody?
Great.
First of all, did you mention Albert Pike? Did he get his 33rd from former members of the Supreme Council and without ritual? So
Most certainly. Albert Pike, it was the, I'm trying to remember. I'm drawing a blank now. My memory's not as good as it used to be. Following the Concordat of 1855, they wanted to, the members of the Supreme Council of Louisiana that went to the southern jurisdiction wanted to show that the Charleston and New Orleans were one. So they had a Supreme Council session in New Orleans, and I believe it was 1857, it was. And they had the list, if you look at the list of officers, Albert Mackey was the only guy from Charleston, and he was only there for a short time, and he left. But every single one of the officers representing the Supreme Council Southern jurisdiction were former Supreme Council Louisiana Masons. And that's when Albert Pike received his 33rd degree, and the only rituals they had were the Supreme Council Louisiana rituals. And so Albert Pike most certainly did receive the 33rd degree using Supreme Council Louisiana rituals by former active members of the Supreme Council of Louisiana. That most certainly is so.
Right. In fact, it wasn't until later that year and following, in fact, you can look it up online, Albert Pike and Charles Laudabot actually ended up rewriting rituals and stuff because of that. They wanted to make a distinction. Like, for instance, we say Master of Kadash now, or, Master of the Royal Secret now, instead of, Sublime Prince of the Royal Secret, So not only did he change some of the names and he changed the order of some of the degrees, but he also rewrote them. Like in 1876, he wrote, the porch in the middle chamber, for his version of the symbolic degrees. And then he actually wrote, basically, what do you call that? Like a monitorial books for each one of them. What's interesting is that the current version of the Southern Jurisdiction Monitor, they don't include his first book, that had the first 3 degrees in it, but they include everything else from the 4th to the 30th.
That's okay. I published it. and the title for the Grand Consistory of Louisiana, Southern Jurisdiction, was changed from Commander-in-Chief to Grand Master of Kadash.
Right.
And they still had that printed on Carondelet Street. They had switched that. And I've had people from other Supreme Councils say, "Why do you say that? It's Commander-in-Chief." And I said, they changed it. And I believe that was because there were 2 Grand Consistories of Louisiana, and they wanted to make a distinction.
Yep. And also, not only that, I just drew a blank. But when they made those changes and stuff that you would see, oh Lord, I legit.
You're getting old.
Yeah, I legit drew a blank. But yeah, because not only do you see that, but what was interesting was that I actually found an old cipher, for the Louisiana stuff, right? And when I was actually talking to Brother De Hoyos, they didn't have that cipher that was used in, in the Laudabot ritual, and then also like an OES ritual and stuff, right? In fact, this girl named Christine from California. She actually sent me an old OES ritual and said they didn't know how to decipher it. And because I had the Louisiana cipher, I was actually able to decipher material in the the magnum opus of Albert Pike and in the Laudabot material and in that OES material, and nobody else had that access. So I was able to share that cipher that was unique to Louisiana work. And what was interesting is that Christine is actually a PHA OES, but yet she had SEL, ciphered material. So I was like, what was that connection there? Did they have any linkage prior?
Yes.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So,
it was the Worshipful Master and Grandmaster. The Worshipful Master Perfect Union moved to San Francisco and created a Scottish Rite Lodge, Perfect Union, in San Francisco, and I believe he was the one that. And I can't pull his name right now. That's I'm a senior moment.
Yeah. So so it's interesting that not only we have our own rituals, but we have our own ciphers. But because we were so far removed from that period, people forgot, how to decipher it, and even what it meant. Even though people were publishing documents with it in it, nobody actually knew what it was until I uncovered it, So, like I said, there's a lot of little hidden secrets, that, makes you if you are part of our tradition, like certain saints and all that stuff, who's who, you know what I'm saying? And so, and that's was one of the things that, like Brother Paul says, would you want just one flavor of ice cream, or would you like to have a whole ice cream parlor of traditions to enjoy?
I like food.
We have a question from Mr. Schofield.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone. I had this question specifically to Brother Rogers. On the PDF that you sent out tonight, there was 2 seals on there, Supreme Council seals. And one that I'm particularly interested in is the Supreme Council of Louisiana seal, particularly the sword. And I noticed that in our jurisdiction, the sword is pointed one way, and in the other one is pointed the opposite way. I would like to know, one, what year was it changed and the reason for it? Now, I heard different verbal rumors, but none has been confirmed yet.
All right, so I actually looked into this maybe about 9 years ago. I can't recall it off the top of my head, but the 2 seals that I actually published, one is from the Grand Consistory. That's the one on the left. And then the one in the middle is actually Supreme Council of America sitting at New Orleans. So, that possible reversal between those 2 seals could just be the differentiate the Grand Consistory versus the Supreme Council. Now, because like I said, that Grand Consistory seal is used throughout that through the minutes book, versus that Supreme Council of America sitting at New Orleans, that's 1839 seal. So that could just be the differentiate between the 2 bodies. For instance, the Grand Consistory has wings down while the Supreme Council has wings up. And then also they actually have a corona, like those little balls going around the crown in the Supreme Council's crown, while in the Grand Consistory's crown, there are no coronas around it. So that could just be to distinguish the 2 bodies. But yeah, like I said, that seal that I shared from Supreme Council USA, that's 1839. That's the original one.
If I might add something to that, the guy I mentioned before, Frank Vaccari, he was a longtime Mason. I also worked for him for about 6 months. He owned the very last letterpress shop in New Orleans, Busy Printing, and he had numerous Masonic pieces of art, letterpress art. And I asked him one time about different designs, and he laughed and he says, it was always up to the printer. He says, so many of these things, they think that this body or that body changed, but all that really happened was the Masonic body asked the printer to print up something, and the printer printed what he wanted. He said it could be eagle wings facing this way. He says it was all up to the printer. He said it had nothing to do with anything more than that. Now, if that's true or not, I don't know, but it's very possible that a lot of the differences you'll see in eagles and swords and all this stuff really didn't mean anything other than the printer had it going this way, and that's what he ran with.
Artistic license.
The reason.
Go ahead. Sorry.
The reason why I asked that question is that I visited the George Long collection a few times, and in that research that I found out is that he wrote in there that the seal is the ones that we had to wear, in which the sword is pointing now, is opposite from the other because he looked at it as a independent Supreme Council, where the northern jurisdiction has the wings up and the southern has it down. Being us in an independent Supreme Council, the wings are pointed out. Now, that was the information that I read, and also it was passed down to me verbally. So I was just looking for, from a historical standpoint, which is correct.
Well, so like I said, if you had that from the collection, well, then that would be the historical record. But like I said, the stuff that I shared, those are actually from the actual minutes. So But like I said, when the Supreme Council of New Orleans was formed, I think the actual seal is the flat, the 90-degree angle wings.
Yeah, the wings being open.
Right.
Not up or down, but open. Yeah.
Right. And also too, because, well, like I said, you could say that like, okay, that's artistic license and stuff, possibly, because when I read the Constitutions, they don't actually mention the orientation. You know what I'm saying? So that could have just been, like orally, hey, this is what I want you to do. And they just did it. You know what I'm saying? And then because of that, and then from there, they passed down that tradition that you were taught, because that's like I said, that's a lot of things. Like I remember I have some brothers who came in from York, right, to like my lodge, and they're like, well, it's not written down and stuff. But I was like, Masonry is an oral tradition, So just because something wasn't written down, that doesn't mean that's not what you were received or taught, And, sometimes what we have in the artifacts of Masonry may not align with what we are currently doing because what we receive and stuff has evolved, So, and we can't and that's where it's one of the things where some people like to pretend that Masonry is a written by the book tradition, but it's not. It's a living thing. It's just like you know how you had different denominations of Christianity. Everybody receives the spirit of Masonry. How they were taught and what they experienced. So what the wings symbolize and stuff. What the sword symbolizes has its own life within the institutions that we're all a part of.
Yeah, I can tell you also, I have minutes from the Grand Consistory of Louisiana back to the 1820s, and they show the wings straight out in there. So it goes back to the 1820s, way before Supreme Council was created.
Brother Paul, Brother Calvin wanted to know, would you repeat those books that you said that Pike wrote that the Southern jurisdiction left out? The first 3 degrees, I'm sorry.
Yes, let me pull it up here.
Well, that the Southern jurisdiction published, but took some of Pike's work out, should I say?
Yeah.
Liturgy of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite of Freemasonry for the Southern Jurisdiction of the United States, 1 through 3rd. And Cornerstone published that a few years ago. So it's on the Cornerstone Book Publishers.
Is there anybody else with any questions? We were going to have closing remarks from my most powerful, illustrious brother, Eddie Gabriel Sr., but his mic, due to technical difficulties, his microphone is not currently working. So is there anything you want to say, Brother Paul?
I just hope this you guys know what you have and how valuable it is to the whole of Freemasonry, even people who don't know anything. And I can promise you there's going to be many, many people who have no idea who you are, no idea that you still exist, no idea what a Scottish Rite Craft Lodge means. But you're doing something and you're preserving something that I believe is in time going to be shown to be more valuable than anybody realizes yet.
Brother Kevion, would you like to say anything in closing?
Yeah. Your lessons that we learned, through this particular tradition of craft, how we are about, freeing people in the emancipation world, even throughout the actual historical record in the public instance of the institution, we have brothers who continually actively live that life, So, one of the things that I'm very impressed with our tradition is that, though it may be a small tradition, our value and impact on the world, not in just Masonry, has been truly remarkable. So like, for instance, Homer Palesi and Plessy versus Fergus, he was a Grand Secretary of the SCL, and so even going forward and stuff, there's a history tradition, even in the civil rights era, in the 1960s and 70s, they played an important role in the greater Louisiana area, pushing for equal rights and, in education. Like George Long was actually an educator by profession. And so he pushed, equal education is in some of the secular publications that had nothing to do with Masonry, but our tenets, you can see, are in what he was professing and pushing. So, that tradition and those lessons of that tradition is very important, because some of our other traditions, they're very loopy. I won't say loopy, but, they're all about like Hermeticism and all this extra highfalutin stuff. But when you look at our version of Masonry, it's very in your face. Your tools are your body, how you interact with the universe, how you progress the universe and not regress bestiality, how you free the human, how you call on the Lord and stuff. Like, there's no fluff to how we present Masonry, where some of the other stuff, how to present Masonry, you don't necessarily see the practicality and making a good man better. That's what I would say.
All right. If you would look in the messages of Brother Paul or Brother Rogers, you'll see a couple of questions for you. Let me pull them up that you might, I know we did a closing, but it just popped up. From Mr. Larry Long.
So yeah, Brother Paul, you might cover like,
Lotta Bay, yeah. Lotta Bay, apparently, from what I gathered, Lotta Bay and Full House had an argument, and they got mad at each other, and their French tempers went up. And Lotta Bay, I have a letter that he ended up going with the Southern jurisdiction, and they made him an active member of the Southern jurisdiction. And the very first thing that he did as an active member of the Southern jurisdiction was to submit a resolution saying that each state should have their own Supreme Council. Well, they shot it down, but he ended up having, I have a collection of letters between him and Albert Pike, and they were close friends. Pike was his student, and Lotta Bay was fed up, and he ended up leaving, and he moved back to Paris, and he pretty much left. But Lotta Bay was a very interesting person in that he was not part of the legal movement. Supreme Council of Louisiana, they had Grand Commander, Lieutenant Grand Commander, they had United States Senator, there were judges, lawyers all over the place. And the Southern jurisdiction was basically merchants. And so they felt that they were outclassed, and the only one that they could compete with any of them was Albert Pike. But Lotta Bay was, what he wrote to Pike that was so telling with me was he said that the French element must give way to the American element, and that's why he has to leave, and he couldn't participate anymore because he's French and America, New Orleans had become American, and he couldn't, and that was his train of thought. But I don't agree with him, but that was what his opinion was.
Yeah, it's kind of like that John the Baptist moment where he's like, I must become lesser so they can become greater, right? But guess who's a part of our first degree? So the thing about it is just like, you have to keep who you are. And I think it's one of those things where like first generation Americans versus second generations, like as you start getting further away from your ancestors, you start losing your identity and your practice. And you may hold on to certain things, but not remember whence they came from, right? So, but the thing about it is like both de Castro and Lauterbach, they actually visited Paris, and they actually brought some SCL and material to the Grand Orient. So they actually have parts of our records and archives over there. So Lauterbach, he played a role and stuff because, for instance, like my first introduction to Louisiana having a distinct higher degree system was Lauterbach's rituals. And then when I looked at Lauterbach's material, and I saw what the SCL was working on, I was like, okay, I can see more similitude between those. Now, like I hadn't got Louis Defoe's work because Louis Defoe, he, I think, was either like the Grand Chancellor or Grand Secretary during that 1850, 1860 period. And he actually wrote a book called Principles of Masonry, which still exists and stuff. I just haven't had the chance to actually get a hard copy yet. And it covers like what the SCL was teaching during that time period from the 1st to the 30th degree. So, if it wasn't for Lauterbach and his publishing and stuff, my understanding of like our tradition would have been a lot more impoverished, but at the same time, because of, the debt that the Southern jurisdiction had to them, Albert Pike had to rewrite literally the entire ritual collection, because he wanted to distinguish what the SJ is from the SCL, So that's Kelvin.
In the letters that I have between Pike and Lotta Bay, apparently when Lotta Bay saw the rituals that Pike had rewritten, he didn't know who wrote them. He just says, this person doesn't know French, doesn't know Latin. Who did this? It was a grammar school child. And Pike went through the roof. And he was blasting Lotta Bay. And Lotta Bay says, hey, I'm sorry. This is what I thought. This is not your end. Well, his rituals ended up having to be revised a few times.
Exactly.
But, yeah.
The truth is truth.
Okay, we got two more questions. He's one brother Calvin said, what about the Supreme Council that he created in Mexico?
Well, he didn't create the Supreme Council. He healed it. Okay. So in 1860, remember the Supreme Council was organized by Samuel Comonfort, who was the president of Mexico. Then also de Castro's son, he went down to Veracruz too. And then they founded Fraternidad Lodge, I think it was. And, so that actually came out of the SCL tradition. And then the year after that, I actually had like the whole timeline right now, but basically it was only like 6 or 9 months. Lauterbach follows up and says, hey, the body that you were with is no longer, regular, recognized, whatever, because Full House patent got pulled. So why don't you come with us? And they're like, okay. So basically in 1860, they got healed over to the Supreme Council of Mexico, became under that Pike Lauterbach lineage. And I think Lauterbach became like their first sovereign grand commander, I think is how it's listed currently, even though that's not 100% like accurate.
Okay, we got, Brother Paul, did you want to speak on that or add to it?
In fact, Brother Omar, he's Mexican. He actually would have better, for knowledge of what actually happened in there than I would. So.
Okay, before we do
Actually, everything I got from you, man. So thank you.
It's basically, Supreme Council of Louisiana was making a presence in Mexico. Pike didn't like that, so he wanted to counter it.
Gotcha. Okay, we got Brother Brown. He has a question.
Hey, greetings, brothers. This is not a question about or a historical question. It's something that I want to ask Brother Poe. When you were giving your closing remarks, but we never really closed, you mentioned preserving, that the Supreme Council of Louisiana should preserve what they got because they have something. So my question is, with the newer generation of Masons that are coming in, or do you see that they are helping to preserve it? And if not, what could they do to keep the history going, the legacy going, if they're not doing it? Because the new generation comes, in my experience, they come with a new thought process about things.
I remember when I was the new guy, I was the kid. I was the young guy who was just trying to learn something. I believe that what needs to be done is constant education. I believe that there was a period of time that there was an active movement to erase all knowledge of the Supreme Council of Louisiana from U.S. Masonry. And that's the best way to kill it. I believe that there has to be an understanding. I believe that there's things, it's the same with the Grand Lodge of Louisiana. I was told things about missing documents. I was told that I said, how come we don't have anything prior to 1850? And they said, well, we had a fire in the late 1800s. All the records from 1870 from 1812 to 1870 were locked in a room, and a fire came and it destroyed everything prior to 1850. I said, wait a second, you mean there was a smart fire that can destroy things from 1812 to 1850, but nothing past 1850? And so I believe that there's got to be a hunger to know and a hunger to investigate and to find out why things don't add up. And I think young kids today are very naturally resistant to be played with. And they want to know something and they want it to make sense. And if it doesn't want to make sense, then they want to know why it doesn't make sense. And I believe that that's a healthy thing in this situation, because I don't believe all of the history is gone. There was too much of it, and I believe it's waiting to be found. And I believe that there's still some very big things that have to be found that's going to change a lot of things, and you just can't stop. You got to keep pushing and let the young guys on their own and say, hey, as long as you're interested in really trying to find something out, go to it, But the what we have in Louisiana and from Louisiana is too important just to let it go away, in my opinion.
That was an excellent question, Brother Brown. Well, I do want to take the time to thank you, Brother Paul and Brother Rogers, for blessing us with those two great presentations. We want to thank everybody for tuning in tonight. This is just the first installment. We have a few more that we're going to get together and discuss and put together for you guys. But like I said, we're very excited. But once again, I have to give thanks and a big thank you to illustrious Brother Eddie Gabriel Sr. for his support and providing this platform for us. And I really think this is the turn of a new day for the Supreme Council of Louisiana as far as educational and awareness goes. Thank you. That's all we can say is thank you, thank you, thank you. And please just be patient with us because more information is coming. And y'all have a blessed night.
Peace and blessings, brothers.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all.
Stay safe, brothers.
Yes, sir. Y'all stay safe too.
Stay safe. Right on.
Brothers and sisters.
I have one thing to say. I thank you tonight for the information that I received. It was informative, enlightening on another level. To all our brothers and the few sisters that's online, please all stay safe. Thank you very much.
You too. Oh, yeah, and thank you to the sisters, the support of the sisters. Our grandmother.
Brother Schofield and Brother Whittingham.
Wow. I am very honored and well pleased with the turnout and the feedback that this presentation has received. Thank you. And I was instructed by Brother Robinson to remind you that you heard it here first. Thank you and have a good day.